Hey, welcome, Gord. Nice to see you. Gord Johns is with me, the candidate for the NDP. My name is Jen Dard. I'm the Executive Director of the Tofino-Long Chamber of Commerce. We are doing these candidate forums that we're going to be posting on our YouTube channel and to our social media accounts so that local people here on the west coast of the island can hear from the prospective candidates for this riding of Courtenay, Alberni. So thanks for being with us today, Gord, and for agreeing to participate in this meeting. We have our format just quickly will be a 2-minute introduction followed by 4 questions posed to each of the candidates from the Chamber of Commerce. We then have 2 submitted questions from our membership and from the local area. And then we'll just go to 2-minute closing statements. So again, thanks for agreeing to participate. And I will start the timer for you. Are you ready for your opening?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. And take it away.
Well, first, thanks, Jen and the Tofino-Long Beach Chamber of Commerce for hosting this event. I want to obviously acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territory of Susanne and Hupachesit in Port Alberni in New Channel Territories. I've been honored and privileged to be the first MP ever elected in the history of our country on the west side of Sutton Pass and to serve our coastal communities. And for those of you that don't know me, my name's Gord Johns. I'm running for re-election as Member of Parliament. We know our country's turning the corner on one of the most difficult times that most of us have lived through. And COVID-19's taught us, a lot about putting aside our differences and to overcome our greatest challenges. And for the last 2 years, I've worked super hard for the people of our riding by reaching across political lines to find solutions and by doing politics differently throughout the COVID pandemic. And as the NDP Small Business and Tourism critic, I've risen more in the House of Commons than any other MP from any opposition party to advocate for our local business community and their workers throughout the pandemic. And also as critic for fisheries and oceans, I've spoken more frequently than any MP in Canadian history on saving wild Pacific salmon. Through these efforts, I've helped change federal policy and get action. Over my 6 years as your Member of Parliament, I've successfully introduced motions on ocean plastics with the help of many of you, protecting veterans' benefits and investing in active transportation, such as bike lanes and trails. And I've worked hard with local governments to achieve 14 times the annual infrastructure investment in our riding than the previous 10 years of Conservative Party representation. Together, we faced the pandemic, and now it's time to face other issues: affordable housing, childcare, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It's time for Canadians to stop having to choose between life-saving medication and feeding their families, and to be able to see a dentist regardless of their income and to have their own family doctor. But without a healthy environment, we can't achieve any of these things. I believe in the science that says that the climate crisis is the defining issue of our time. It's time to reduce our carbon emissions, transition to clean energy. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
No.
In the interest of keeping things moving, but thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
So our first question is exactly about something that you just mentioned, pandemic business recovery. So some sectors, notably tourism and hospitality, have not yet fully recovered from the impacts of COVID-19 and are consistently dealing with regulatory changes to the business environment. Many businesses still need support, and in particular are seeking help to access a pool of skilled workers from which to hire and train. So if elected, what will be the economic priorities of your government to help small businesses recover from the impacts of the pandemic and deal with the current issues?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we want to make sure, sorry, Jen, how much time do I have to answer this?
2 minutes for each.
Okay, great, thanks. First and foremost, we're not through the pandemic. We're heading into the 4th wave. Many businesses still need emergency supports, even businesses through this busy summer that cater to international tourism, like whale watching. They absolutely need the wage subsidy and the rent assistance program to go through to next spring. It's absolutely critical that they get those supports. And we've been pushing hard for that. Businesses that have been left out, startups that still haven't got any support whatsoever, they need to backdate those programs so that they're not carrying the debt load. We need to ensure those that got the CEBA loan, that they're not having to repay that by the end of next year. It's too quick. How many businesses can pay back that much debt in that short a period of time? It's unreasonable to ask them to do that. We want to see that push back at least till the end of 2025 on that refundable portion, and actually increase it to 80,000 from 60,000, because we do believe that there is going to be an impact with this 4th wave. And obviously, number one is for people to get vaccinated. We need people to get vaccinated so we can get back to normal as quick as possible. The other thing that's impacting our labor market force is affordable housing. Clearly, People aren't buying houses in Tofino and spending over $1 million for worker housing. We're not seeing that happen. In fact, we're losing housing stock every day as houses sell in the community that normally cater to supporting those workers. So we need affordable housing, and our commitment is to build 500,000 units, including non-market housing, and we need affordable, universal, quality childcare, something that the NDP has been pushing for, and we're going to continue to push for it. So when people say we need more jobs, the Conservatives will try to say that. We actually believe there is jobs. We need to provide those workers the supports they need, and they want to kill an affordable childcare program that we absolutely need. And tax breaks to developers aren't going to solve the housing crisis. We need non-market housing.
Okay, perfect timing. And also another segue to the next question on affordable housing specifically. So housing affordability supports inclusive growth and builds communities. The rising cost of housing and the lack of rental stock in BC is making it hard for residents to live here and for businesses to attract and retain workers in high demand areas like Tofino. While affordable housing solutions generally fall on the shoulders of the provincial and municipal regional government bodies, the federal government also has a role to play on this issue. If elected, how would your party incentivize the development of affordable housing?
That's a great question, Jen, and it's a complex one. The Liberal government in the early 90s abandoned the National Housing Strategy. In the 70s and 80s, they were producing 25,000 units of non-market housing. That's co-ops, social housing, rent-protected housing. They were lauded for doing great work. In fact, 10% of our housing stock in Canada at the time was non-market housing. Now we're less than 4%. In Europe, they're at 30%. They get it. They don't commodify all of their housing stock. I grew up in co-op housing, so I actually know how important it was for my parents to have safe, secure housing. My dad was a transmission mechanic. My mom worked as a clerk. They subsidized single-parent families, people on disabilities. It was a great mix, but it provided safe, secure housing, and they were able to put away money and get into the free market. That's exactly what we need right now. We need the federal government to get back in the housing game. In fact, it was the feds that downloaded to the provinces, that downloaded on the local governments to inherit this huge task of providing housing. Now we've got housing issues for working people, and we've also got a homelessness crisis. Over 300,000 people are homeless right now, and the Liberals, they've rolled out 5,000 units a year over the last couple of years to solve the homelessness crisis. This isn't the solution. We need rapid housing to get out the door for homelessness. We need co-op models and social housing for working families. Our proposal is to build 500,000 units in the next 5 years to get people housed. Local governments need a federal partner. The provincial government of BC is building half the non-market housing in the country, yet they don't have a partner. We need to obviously charge foreigners that are buying properties and flipping them a 20% tax. Go after money laundering in our country and help incentivize first-time home buyers and help them get into the market.
Okay. Thanks. Some good points brought up there, and I know it is a very complex issue to answer in 2 minutes, as is the next one. And this is just touching on some major points for all the parties, but the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2021 report urgently underscores the need for strong, sustained cuts to greenhouse gas emissions on a short timeline. What is your party's plan for addressing this urgent need while balancing the country's economic reality?
Well, I believe in the science that says the climate crisis is the defining issue of our time. If we don't tackle this, none of the other issues we're talking about matter at all. It's time to reduce carbon emissions and transition to clean energy and renewable energy and create well-paying, sustainable jobs. And preserve our ancient old growth rainforests. The Conservatives don't even believe that the climate crisis is real. I mean, they're rolling out the more you burn, the more you earn type bonus credit card system to tackle the climate crisis. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's full of red tape. The party that says that they're trying to eliminate red tape, I can't even imagine how they're going to deal with it. And the Liberals act like it just isn't real. In terms of the pace of how they're doing it. I mean, the Prime Minister's hypocrisy has been staggering. He declared a climate emergency in the House of Commons, and then the next day approved the Trans Mountain Pipeline. He pretends to be a climate leader, but bought that pipeline, and he's giving billions of dollars in oil and gas subsidies. In fact, they've risen $900 million a year under his watch. So, we know that both of them aren't serious about it. We've got a plan. That's to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies once and for all, undo the Liberals' decision to let big polluters off the hook, and cut emissions by more than a half and meet the 1.5-degree target that scientists say is necessary to prevent a climate catastrophe, and create, again, thousands of good-paying jobs by investing in, clean energy, efficient energy, zero emission homes, electric transit, zero emission vehicles, and retrofit homes across the country, and create a climate bank to invest in fighting the climate emergency instead of an infrastructure bank that only aims to enrich rich investors.
Okay, can I pick up on something that you mentioned there? You're talking about holding big polluters to account, and what is the NDP plan for that specifically?
Yeah, so to make sure they're actually paying and eliminating all oil and gas subsidies. So right now we need to cap emissions and meet our targets. 50% reduction is our target plan. We need to do that, and we need to have more accountability in Parliament. We need a cabinet, a committee within cabinet that is dealing with the climate crisis like we're dealing with a war effort. And we need an independent officer that is making sure that we're meeting our climate targets. And, we just passed a Climate Accountability Act, and we improved that act as New Democrats. It was actually Jack Layton that initially introduced it. It wouldn't have been the bill we tabled, that the Liberals tabled, but we did fight to improve it, because right now the accountability is weak at best, and there is a lack of independent oversight, and we need independent oversight to ensure we're meeting our climate targets.
Okay, thanks. That's great.
Yeah, you bet.
Our next question touches on Indigenous reconciliation. And the question is your party committed to implementing the full 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 2015 report? And please highlight the strategy that your government would prioritize in this area.
Well, first we need a timeline, whether it be the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action or the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to justice. Right now, we had the government tabled the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to justice 2 years ago now, and we have not seen any timeline on how they're going to implement it. In terms of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, they haven't even completed a dozen of those calls to action. They're falling way behind. And right now, obviously, language is key. It's absolutely essential. We're losing the nations in our riding and across the country are losing those knowledge holders, those language holders as we speak. So time is of the essence. It's absolutely critical that we support the nations in their calls to support that. We know that the calls to action around children that went missing at residential school, and the accountability that needs to take place, and the investments that needs to take place for those nations and Indigenous peoples to get to truth, they need those supports. And so the government needs to follow through with the supports and getting them the truth so they absolutely have it. But right now, in terms of reconciliation, what do we see? We see the Conservative and Liberal governments constantly fighting Indigenous people in court, whether it be going after children. They've spent millions of dollars fighting Indigenous children in court, $19 million fighting the New Chalnoth in court. Finally, they backed off in their litigation against the New Chalnoth, but now they're not at the table, negotiating fairly with New Chalnoth so they can get on the water fishing instead of constantly fighting for the rights that we know that are protected under the Constitution and their court-protected rights. Obviously, title and rights is huge. Investments in housing and infrastructure, health and wellness, language and culture, as I cited earlier, and economic development. The government needs to make reconciliation a real priority, and they need to prioritize this now.
So just to be clear, the question was regarding those 94 recommendations. Is that something that NDP is committed to?
Absolutely. We've been committed to it. We've been in the House of Commons repeatedly calling for a timeline for the government to prioritize this. We've been raising this repeatedly, and I've risen, almost more than anybody in British Columbia on these issues, and I'll continue to if I'm sent back to Ottawa.
Okay, thanks. So we had a couple of submitted questions, and this is a really interesting one. Like many rural areas, this region's need for social services, including mental health support, has increased dramatically over the last 5 years. So how does your government propose to strengthen these supports, both across the board and in rural areas specifically?
That's a great question, Jen. Obviously, the federal government, when it comes to health, they transfer money to the provinces. We've saw the Harper government cut health transfers. Now we hear the Conservatives say they're going to increase health transfers, but get this, they're only going to do $5 billion of that, or just over that, in the next 5 years. And then the other $50 billion of their $55 billion is going to come in if they get reelected, and primarily in year 8, 9, and 10. Does it sound familiar? Yeah, it's the kind of stuff that Justin Trudeau would do. He'd announce big money for housing, and they would roll it. He'd have to get elected 3, 4 times before people saw it. This isn't acceptable. When you tell Canadians that you're going to improve health and supports in the healthcare system, you need to invest in it. So we believe that mental health should be included in our healthcare system. The Conservatives believe that it should be a tax credit for employers to give their employees help when they need it. Well, that's unacceptable. A lot of people are off work when they have a mental health injury. COVID has shown us how many people are struggling with mental health issues. It is absolutely absurd to think that it should be funneled through an employer. It should be part of our healthcare system. We believe our healthcare system should be head to toe, Jen. It should be mental health. You should have dental coverage if you need to go to the dentist, and you should be able to get medicine without, using your healthcare card, not your credit card. And people are, struggling to make ends meet. Meanwhile, the ultra wealthy and the ultra rich are profiting off the pandemic. We're seeing corporations like Amazon not even paying tax in Canada when we can afford to. And people who have mental health needs need support. And COVID, we know that it's getting even way worse than ever before. Everybody's struggling. Nobody is being left behind by the COVID pandemic. And this is a critical time for the federal government to transfer monies to the provinces specifically to support them.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, and so our last question for you today, before we just move into a quick summary or final statement. The situation currently playing out at Fairy Creek on southern Vancouver Island is drawing a lot of parallels to Clayoquot Sound in the early 90s. And while forestry is an area of provincial jurisdiction, the federal government's Species at Risk Act comes into play with any old growth area. So if elected, is there anything your party could do to help resolve this conflict?
Well, it's a great question, Jen, and obviously it's something top of mind. The forestry does fall under the purvey of the provincial government. However, the federal government absolutely has a critical role. A few important reasons around climate change and their climate mitigation, and in terms of reconciliation. It's absolutely critical that the federal government comes to the table and that the Indigenous peoples have a real partner. When we talk about climate change and how we're going to tackle the climate crisis, Indigenous peoples need to be full and equal partners if we're going to truly tackle the climate crisis and if we're going to have true reconciliation. I've been speaking to the chief of Kuwait, Chief Dennis, and I asked him if there was conservation financing available, money available to support giving you different choices, would you consider it? And he said, absolutely. But so far, nobody's presented that. So I've been raising this in Ottawa in June, calling on the federal government to increase money for Indigenous peoples, for Indigenous conservation protected areas, something that we know Eli Enns and Tofino-Long have been leading on in that conversation. And right now, the federal government puts $2.3 billion over 5 years for trying to meet Canada's 25% by 2025 goals. That's not enough. They're subsidizing oil and gas $18 billion. They bought a pipeline for $17 billion. Clearly, their priorities are out of whack. We need the federal government to put conservation money directly available to Indigenous communities for protecting ancient old growth rainforests, for protecting the water for Indigenous communities. But it needs to be Indigenous led. It needs to be that the Indigenous communities have resources at the table to make the decisions they need to make. And that's something that I'm going to fight for. We've committed $500 million towards that. We've pushed other parties to do something similar. but we need to make sure that we have those resources on the table. And I'm working on a deal in Clayoquot with Tolokowit and Ahousaht doing something very similar right now. And we've got commitment from the federal government. We want to see that as a model for other nations to look at and consider.
Thanks, Gord. So we've covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time, but we're sticking to our timeline. And now I'd like to give you the opportunity just for a 2-minute summation or to highlight the points that you want people from this area to remember.
Well, first, again, thank you for hosting this really important dialogue. I wish I was seeing everybody in person. I remember being in Tofino just 2 years ago at an election, and the only party that didn't show up, the Conservative Party, yet they want to win the seat again. We know they don't show up. We had an MP for 15 years. What did he do? He supported gutting the Fisheries Act. He supported cutting fisheries staff. He supported cutting the shutting down of the Life Surfguard program, which has cost people lives in our communities. The closing of the MCTS, Marine Communication Control Centers. I mean, this is the kind of legacy that they left, cutting support for Veterans Affairs. They cut a third of Veterans Affairs. They don't believe in climate change. We know that. We don't want to go back. People don't want to go back. They fought Indigenous people. They oppressed people in our communities, and they wanted seniors to work longer. They failed to invest in our communities. Part of the reason we've been able to generate so much investment is when I go to Victoria and Ottawa, I can make the argument that we were completely forgotten and abandoned. They didn't table legislation that helped our communities. You know, our MP was invisible. He tabled a bill for a national vitamin D day. It didn't pass. Maybe that's important to him. But we've tabled real legislation that's going to make an impact on the environment, whether it be plastics or supporting veterans or helping workers get back to place, or an auxiliary Coast Guard program for Indigenous peoples, things that are going to make a difference in people's lives, supporting firefighters. The other MP that I replaced, he tabled another piece of legislation that made it to remove the excise tax on your diamond jewelry. I'm not making this stuff up. This is who their priorities are. They're with the ultra rich and the well-connected. They need to pay their fair share. And it shouldn't, we can do better. We can improve lives for all of us, and we can tackle these huge issues. And this is something that we're going to be bringing forward in the coming week ahead.
Well, thanks so much again, Gord. And I just wanted to close by saying that voting takes place on the 20th of September. And we'll link to all of our election information. We'll include links to how to vote and how to make sure you're registered to vote. So I just wanted to thank you again and wish you the best of luck with the rest of the campaign. And yeah, thanks for engaging with us. It's really, I think, important for local areas to hear from their prospective representatives.
Thanks, Jen.
Okay.
Good luck, everybody.
Rest of your day.
Yeah, take care. Click over.